Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the team that takes that stack of historical sources and research you send over, and we try to pull out the operating manual for these often forgotten American institutions.
And today, we're really opening a door, aren't we? Into a version of American history that honestly feels profoundly foreign now.
Yeah, it does. We're talking about an era when the safety net, things like insurance, healthcare, basic support, it was all woven together, paid for, and run entirely by, well, neighbors, by peers, fellow citizens.
That's such a crucial point, because when you think about social welfare today, your mind immediately goes to the government, right? The New Deal, Social Security starting up in the 30s.
Standard stuff.
Yeah, but what the sources we looked at show, especially David Beito's work, From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, it's incredibly detailed, is that the essential architecture of Social Security, things like life insurance, sickness benefits, even pretty comprehensive healthcare, historically that was built by voluntary associations, ordinary people getting together.
So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to try and reconstruct this vast network. It's largely forgotten now in these fraternal societies that basically were America's original safety net. And we want to go beyond just the numbers, the statistics, and really understand the philosophy that drove it. Because it wasn't charity as we think of it. It was more about self-determination.
It absolutely speaks directly to that foundational American idea of liberty. We're exploring a principle that Alexis Tocqueville observed way back almost 2 centuries ago now.
Right. His observations on America.
Exactly. He noted that what really defined the American character was this unparalleled ability to associate, to form groups. So when a problem came up, maybe founding a church, building a school, or crucially for our topic, setting up social services, citizens didn't first petition some distant authority.
They didn't write to Washington or the state capitol.
No. They formed a committee. They started a lodge, an association. They figured out how to solve it themselves locally.
And the idea there, I guess, is that this practice, this habit of self-governance, organizing solutions through the community rather than waiting for the state.
It wasn't just practical, right? It was seen as fundamental to maintaining a free society.
That's it precisely.
Yeah.
If you solve your own problems, you maintain your civic independence. You're not dependent.
You're an active participant.
Yes. And that tradition, that deep-seated habit, allowed these voluntary groups to become the primary providers of really quite comprehensive services for millions of Americans, people who otherwise would have faced the constant threat of poverty, the poorhouse, total degradation.
Okay, so let's start with that philosophical core then, this shift that really defined the movement. Why did millions of ordinary Americans, working class folks, flock to these fraternal orders instead of, say, relying on the older existing forms of aid? It seems to boil down to this idea of reciprocity. Yeah, reciprocity over charity. And the sheer scale of affiliation was staggering, especially among people who weren't wealthy. We're talking about something that was absolutely central, really woven into the fabric of working class life.
Okay.
We have documentation, like there's this 1894 New Hampshire Bureau of Labor report. And it states pretty explicitly that the tendency to join fraternal organizations, specifically for sickness relief and insurance, was, and this is their phrase, well-nigh universal.
Wow. Well-nigh universal.
Yeah, specifically among the laboring classes and those of moderate means.
So that term universal, it really elevates it, doesn't it? It's not just a hobby or some optional social club people joined if they felt like it.
No. It was seen as an economic necessity. It was a financial tool, a form of essential infrastructure for managing risk.
Okay, infrastructure.
Yeah.
And what about the ethical difference between this system and, say, the alternatives available back then?
Oh, the difference is stark. You have to picture the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Public charity, what usually meant the poorhouse, it was notoriously stigmatized.
Deeply shameful.
Deeply shameful, minimal support, often dehumanizing. And private philanthropy, while maybe better funded sometimes, it was very hierarchical. You had the wealthy donor, often imposing their own moral standards on the recipient, who is usually impoverished.
Treating them as somehow lesser or morally flawed just because they needed help.
Exactly. There was this inherent power imbalance. The donor held the power. The recipient was often made to feel dependent, maybe even grateful in a sort of subservient way.
That's the system where getting help often meant sacrificing your dignity.
Precisely what fraternalism was set up to avoid. Fraternal aid at its core was rooted in this ethical principle of reciprocity. And the key feature, the absolute game changer, was that donors and recipients were peers.
Huh.
They were neighbors, coworkers, friends, usually from the same kind of economic background. So when you received aid, you weren't getting, alms from some rich person looking down on you.
You were in a charity case.
No. You were receiving money from a collective fund that you yourself had paid into, and crucially, a fund you'd contribute to again once you were back on your feet. The person receiving aid today could easily be the one donating tomorrow.
The whole dynamic shifts then. It becomes an obligation that's owed to you based on your membership, your past contributions, your commitment to the group.
Exactly. It maintains self-respect because it's framed as a right, not a gift or an act of pity.
And this philosophical stance you mentioned, it actually led to a change in the language they used.
Yeah, they were very conscious about language. Some earlier benevolent societies might have used terms like charity or relief to describe their payouts. But these newer, massive organizations, like the Independent Order of Oddfellows, the IOOF, they were hugely influential. They actively worked to change that vocabulary.
What do they use instead?
They introduced and really hammered home terms like benefit, and perhaps most powerfully, the word right.
That simple shift from relief to right. That sounds like the core innovation, legally and ethically.
It absolutely transformed the meaning of the whole transaction. There's a quote from an IOF member talking about this exact shift, and he noted that the money paid out during sickness, quote, is not paid or received as charity. It is every brother's right and paid to everyone when sick, whether he be high or low, rich or poor.
So it doesn't matter your status within the lodge or outside it. If you're a member in good standing and you meet the conditions, you get the benefit.
Correct. That distinction established the aid as this non-judgmental contractual obligation, something you earned through your membership, through your continued participation. It reinforced your status as a responsible, free citizen who is planning for your own future.
Not a supplicant, dependent on someone else's goodwill.
Exactly. So imagine you're a factory worker back then and you fall ill. You're not standing in line somewhere, metaphorical cap in hand. You are asserting a claim on a collective insurance policy that you yourself own a share of.
That must have felt incredibly empowering for people who otherwise had very little economic power.
It was genuinely revolutionary for its time. It effectively moved support during sickness and after death out of that murky moral sphere of charity and placed it securely into the contractual economic sphere. The whole system was really designed to let the working class face the unavoidable risks of industrial life, injury, illness, death, without facing that ultimate humiliation of the poorhouse or a pauper's grave.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we need to grasp the magnitude. You used the term universal earlier. Quantitatively, just how big was this movement in its prime? It sounds like a whole parallel economy of social services.
The numbers are frankly staggering, and they really show that this wasn't some niche thing. It was the default way people managed risk in America for decades. We have figures from 1930, the President's Research Committee on Social Trends. They conservatively estimated there were 20 million members in these fraternal societies.
20 million.
And other credible estimates from the time actually reach as high as 35 million.
20 to 35 million members in a U.S. population much, much smaller than today's. That's a massive chunk of the adult population, especially adult men, but increasingly women too, right?
Absolutely. Just to give that some context, that membership base was larger than every other organized group in American civic life at that time, with only one exception: churches.
Wow. Only churches had more members.
That's it. So this wasn't some fringe movement. It was a dominant force, deeply, deeply embedded in civic life, in economic life, right across the country.
And who are these people? Who made up the ranks of this voluntary army, so to speak? Was it mostly, say, union guys, or was it broader than that?
Oh, the base was incredibly broad. It really reflected a true cross-section, maybe not the very wealthy, but certainly across the working and middle segments of society.
Right.
The records show members included, quoting here, the middle-class workman, the salaried clerk, the farmer, the artisan, the country merchant, and the laborer, a real mix.
What united them then?
Well, they were united by a common understanding of risk, the precariousness of life, especially industrial life, and a very powerful shared desire to avoid the poorhouse at all costs. They saw the fraternal order as basically an insurance mechanism, a way, as one source put it, for poor men to ensure to create bread and meat for their families, protecting them from want, the poorhouse, charity, and degradation.
And the source material you looked at suggests that this reached deep even into the poorest immigrant communities, places where cash was obviously scarcest. Yeah. Why would people who are, the poorest of the poor, why would they prioritize paying lodge dues?
It's a great question, because the risk of absolute destitution, of having nothing if the breadwinner got sick or died, was just so incredibly high. The protection the lodge offered, even if it seemed modest, was priceless in that context. Okay. There's a fascinating 1909 study of working men's families in New York City that showed this really vividly. 40% of families earning less than $1,000 a year, which was a low income even then, had at least one lodge member.
40%, that's huge.
And even more striking, among the families they designated the poorest of the poor, so earning between $600 and $800 a year, 37% still managed to maintain their affiliation.
That level of dedication, spending scarce money on dues, it really implies that the cost of not being a member was seen as far riskier than the cost of the membership itself.
Precisely. It was like non-negotiable insurance for survival. And that same study also highlighted something else interesting. For many people, ethnicity and the sort of cultural tradition of association often mattered even more than income in predicting membership.
So immigrant groups brought these traditions with them.
Very much so. Groups like Russians, who at the time were predominantly Jewish immigrants, and Bohemians, they came from places with deep, long-standing European traditions of mutual assistance, guild structures, community support networks. And the study found that even in that lowest income bracket, 7 out of every 10 Russian and Bohemian families maintained some kind of fraternal membership. 7 out of 10. Incredible. That inherent cultural habit of self-organization. That must become even more critical when we start talking about Black fraternalism, right? Which had to operate under conditions of intense hostility and exclusion.
Yes, Black fraternalism is, I think, perhaps the most profound example of that Tocquevillian impulse you mentioned, but refined, sharpened by absolute necessity.
How so?
Well, observers at the time, even white observers, noted that Black Americans demonstrated this incredible flair for organization. They developed these systems of mutual insurance and voluntary association, as one source said, to the highest degree. Because when white society systematically denied them access to commercial insurance, to banks, to decent hospitals, the Black community didn't just despair. They built their own. A parallel civil society.
And this goes way back, doesn't it? We're not just talking about Reconstruction or later.
No, not at all. We're talking about the founding era of the Republic. The Prince Hall Grand Lodge, for example, was established in Boston by Prince Hall himself way back in 1791.
1791. Wow. Yeah. And it immediately attracted the absolute cream of Black intellectual, social, political, and economic leadership. People like Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, major figures. These lodges weren't just for benefits. They were vital centers for political strategizing, community building, developing leadership.
And they evolved pretty quickly, it seems, from being purely social or maybe moral organizations into quite complex economic institutions. Can you tell us more about the United Order of True Reformers, the UOTR? Their approach sounds revolutionary.
The UOTR is just a spectacular example of this organizational ingenuity in action. It was founded in 1872 by William Washington Brown, a man who had actually been born enslaved. Brown recognized that his community needed practical, tangible support more than just, say, temperance lectures. So the UOTR became the first Black society to provide really meaningful life insurance benefits payouts that went significantly beyond just covering funeral costs, which was often the limit before.
So providing real financial support to families.
Yes, but their impact went way beyond just insurance. They became this incredible economic engine for self-sufficiency.
How did they manage that?
Well, the UOTR was absolutely determined to promote economic independence and directly challenge white financial control, especially in the Jim Crow South. They ended up operating this impressive array of businesses. They had a bank, the Reformers Bank in Richmond. They ran retail stores. They even built and operated a 150-room hotel.
A bank, stores, a hotel, all run by the Fraternal Order.
All run by the Order for the benefit of its members and the broader community. The Reformers Bank was particularly crucial. It provided capital, loans, and credit in places where white-owned banks simply refused to serve Black customers or entrepreneurs. So this wasn't just mutual aid in the narrow sense. It was a complex, sophisticated act of political and economic defiance, building power from within.
And we absolutely have to mention Maggie L. Walker here, too, the leader of the Independent Order of St. Luke, the IOSL. She took this model of self-determination even further, didn't she, with a specific focus on empowering Black women.
Oh, Maggie Walker was an organizational genius, plain and simple. She established the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, and she was very explicit about viewing these fraternal businesses as instruments for collective uplift, political and economic.
And the focus on women.
Yes, she deliberately created business and employment opportunities specifically for Black women. Roles like bank tellers, bookkeepers, managers' positions, completely unheard of for Black women in the mainstream white economy at the time.
That's incredible.
And Walker's message was sharp. It was unambiguous. She argued that Black consumers must redirect their money, their deposits, their spending, away from white banks and white stores and towards their own community institutions. She argued quite powerfully that patronizing white businesses actually funded and encouraged the oppression of, quote, Negro business enterprises.
So within the Black community, these mutual aid societies weren't just a safety net. They were literally the mechanism for creating a vibrant, autonomous civil society, a space where they could control their own capital, their own future, entirely outside the segregated and deeply hostile mainstream.
They understood fundamentally that economic independence was the absolute bedrock needed for any kind of real political and social advancement. The power of association, that Tocquevillian idea again, was their ultimate tool for liberation in a society determined to hold them down.
Okay, this incredible scale, this deep penetration into communities, it leads us to the practical side, the mechanics. We need to move beyond just thinking about cash payouts and really understand the sheer breadth of services this network provided. How comprehensive was this social safety net in actual practice?
Oh, it was remarkably comprehensive, much more than just life insurance. It covered really everything from financial security to direct, hands-on labor assistance, and maybe most surprisingly to us today, they even ran quite sophisticated healthcare systems in large residential campuses for dependents.
So the main types were secret societies, sick and funeral benefit societies, and the life insurance one.
Yeah, those were the three broad categories, and they often overlapped or worked together to cover the full spectrum of what members might need.
Let's start with the financial security side then, the hard numbers. How much money are we talking about flowing through these voluntary systems?
We're talking substantial amounts of capital. Just look at orders like the Modern Woodmen of America, the MWA, which was one of the largest. They provided huge life insurance policies. By 1908, just 1908, only 200 of the leading fraternal societies had already paid out well over $1 billion in death benefit.
$1 billion.
Yeah.
By 1908.
Yes. And remember, this money wasn't coming from, big government reserves or wealthy philanthropists. It was coming from the pooled contributions, the assessments paid in by millions of ordinary working people. For the families who received it, this benefit was often the only thing standing between relative financial stability, maybe keeping the house, and immediate total destitution.
And the fraternity, the brotherhood or sisterhood, it meant more than just getting a check in the mail, right? You mentioned hands-on help from your neighbors.
Oh, absolutely. That direct, tangible mutual aid, that was really the lifeblood of the movement. It cemented the bonds. The MWA, for instance, they structured themselves with local lodges called camps, and the members were called neighbors.
Neighbors helping neighbors.
Literally. And they were often obligated by the lodge rules to provide direct labor assistance to fellow members in need. The descriptions we have of this fraternity in action are really quite moving.
Like what?
Things like pooling funds on the spot to help a stricken member pay his bills. Or if a neighbor got sick during harvest time, the other members would literally go out and harvest his wheat for him so his family wouldn't lose the crop.
Oh, wow.
They'd haul his grain to market for him. They'd get together and cut his entire winter's supply of fuel wood. Or if a neighbor's house burned down, which was common, the lodge might mobilize everyone to quickly rebuild it.
That's social capital being translated directly into physical labor, into survival. It fundamentally changes the risk model, doesn't it? It's not just monetary. It's based on collective action, collective responsibility.
Exactly. It creates this powerful community obligation that goes way beyond just the fine print of an insurance contract. But, arguably the most innovative and maybe the most disruptive aspect of the whole fraternal system was its approach to healthcare, what they called lodge practice.
Okay, tell us more about lodge practice. How did that actually work? Because this sounds like member-owned, member-operated healthcare decades before we started talking about things like HMOs or managed care.
It was essentially a prepaid system, really ahead of its time. Members could get physician care for a fixed and usually incredibly low annual rate. Often it was around $2 a year.
$2 for a year's worth of doctor access.
Yeah, and just to put that $2 in perspective, that was roughly a single day's wage for an average laborer back then.
1 day's pay for a year of care.
Pretty much. And this coverage sometimes even extended to the member's immediate family as well for maybe a slightly higher fee. The way it worked was the physician signed a contract directly with the lodge, agreeing to treat all the members of that lodge for that fixed annual per capita fee.
So for basically giving up 1 day's wages, a working man, maybe his family too, had medical access for the entire year. What were the consequences of that model, economically and socially?
Well, it completely flipped the incentives of the traditional fee-for-service model. Think about it. If you pay a doctor every time you visit, you're naturally incentivized to wait, right? To put it off until you're really sick, because every visit costs money.
Sure, you avoid the doctor unless you absolutely have to go.
But under lodge practice, because the fee was already paid up front, members were actually incentivized to seek care earlier, maybe even preventive care. A patient had access without the fear, the terror really, of getting a huge bill they couldn't pay.
So easier access, maybe earlier treatment?
Yes. Now, physicians who disliked the system, and many in the medical establishment did, they complained bitterly. They said patients felt overly entitled, that they would, quote, quibble with the doctor or pester them with what the doctors considered trivial ailments.
Like what kind of trivial thing?
Well, one example given was a worried mother calling the lodge doctor because her child had a stomach ache and she was terrified it might be appendicitis. Turns out, the doctor diagnosed it as simply, quote, too much indulgence in mince pie.
Okay, so from the patient's viewpoint, that's liberation, right? She could call the doctor without fearing a massive bill, just to be sure. But from the doctor's perspective, maybe they felt their professional authority, their time, was being undermined by patients acting like demanding consumers.
That's exactly the tension. It empowered the patient, made them more assertive, and it definitely challenged the economic elitism, the professional dominance of traditional medicine. And this whole system, this lodge practice idea, it reached its absolute peak with the creation of dedicated fraternal hospitals.
They built their own hospitals.
Yes. Large modern facilities in some cases. For example, the Security Benefit Association, the SBA, they built a huge state-of-the-art general hospital in Topeka, Kansas back in 1916.
And how did that operate?
It offered completely free care to all current SBA members in good standing. And critically, the doctors on staff there were paid a salary by the SBA. They weren't working fee for service, which, again, removes the potential profit motive from ordering more tests or procedures for individual treatments.
That's fascinating. And then maybe the ultimate testament to this self-organizing power, especially in the face of adversity, was the Taborian Hospital in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. We really need to convey what a monumental achievement this was.
Oh, the Taborian Hospital is just an incredible story. It opened its doors in 1942, built and run by the International Order of 12 Knights and Daughters of Tabor, a black fraternal society.
And Mound Bayou, that was significant, wasn't it?
Hugely significant. Mound Bayou was located in Bolivar County, which was one of the absolute poorest counties in the entire United States at the time, predominantly black, mostly sharecroppers and farm laborers. And this hospital, this modern medical facility, it wasn't funded by big government grants or wealthy white philanthropists. It was financed literally brick by the members themselves.
How? These were poor people.
Through small, regular assessments. Pennies and nickels collected consistently over years, specifically earmarked for the hospital fund. Imagine the discipline the collective will require to do that.
Building and equipping a hospital in the heart of the Jim Crow South, funded entirely by the laboring corps themselves. The logistical feat alone is just mind-boggling.
And what it meant was that thousands of low-income black patients could finally bypass the segregated, often deeply disrespectful, and frankly, often poor-quality white medical system. They could, as one observer beautifully put it, walk through the front door of a competent, modern hospital and receive courteous professional care. It was an assertion of dignity, of independence. The hospital became the central pillar of community pride, a powerful, tangible symbol of what voluntary association could achieve, even against the most overwhelming systemic odds.
It's incredible. And beyond healthcare, this fraternal structure also took on roles we now associate much more with the state or maybe the church caring for dependents, specifically orphans and the elderly.
Yes, that was seen as a core tenet of the fraternal family. taking care of their own. The Loyal Order of Moose, for example, established Mooseheart. It was near Aurora, Illinois, founded in 1913.
And Mooseheart wasn't just a basic orphanage, right?
No, not at all. It was conceived and designed as a vocational child city. The explicit goal wasn't just basic care, and it wasn't primarily about preparing kids for university either. The focus was intensely practical, providing high-quality vocational training, graduating students as skilled craftsmen, mechanics, farmers, homemakers, people ready to be self-reliant citizens in the industrial world.
And they seem to have been very conscious about the atmosphere, trying to avoid that cold, institutional feel that plagued so many orphanages back then.
Oh, absolutely meticulous about it. They deliberately adopted what was called the cottage system, or a modified cottage system. They rejected the big, impersonal barrack-style dormitories.
Why the cottage?
The goal was explicitly to foster a normal home atmosphere. Children were grouped into smaller, family-style units, living in individual houses on the campus, usually supervised by house mothers and house fathers. This allowed them to form genuine bonds, closer relationships.
Like a real extended family.
Exactly. And the sources say the children at Mooseheart and also at the SBA Children's Home in Topeka, they genuinely referred to each other as shirt-tail brothers and sisters. They maintained that sense of being part of a large, supportive, fraternal family even after they graduated and left.
Okay, so we've built this picture of a really comprehensive system, rooted in reciprocity, in earned right, providing tangible benefits from healthcare to child rearing. But the source material also makes it really clear that this aid wasn't just automatic. It was highly conditional, wasn't it? This wasn't unconditional government entitlement as we might think of it today.
No, definitely not. And that's a critical feature that distinguishes this kind of mutual aid from both traditional charity and modern welfare systems. The whole system was really predicated on the belief that aid recipients, the members, had a moral obligation to exert self-control, to maintain good character.
So being a member wasn't just about paying dues, it was about upholding certain standards.
Yes. The groups deliberately wove character building right into their structures, their rituals, their rules.
Can you give an example? How did that moral instruction actually play out, say, in their ceremonies?
Sure. The initiation ceremony for some groups, like the Independent Order of St. Luke, the IOSL we mentioned with Maggie Walker, it often featured a kind of symbolic journey or an ordeal. Right. And during parts of this journey, the candidate would find, quote, no friendly hand extended. They had to struggle alone for a bit.
Why? What was the lesson?
The explicit lesson, taught right there in the ritual, was that self-reliance must be exerted. The ritual itself served to teach that mastering yourself, controlling your impulses, was the necessary prerequisite before you could fully receive the brotherhood's or sisterhood's protection and support.
They were actively promoting what some writers at the time called the kingship of self-control, meaning, mastery over your own desires, passions, vices like gluttony, overdrinking, laziness, things that could lead to needing aid.
Exactly. And this philosophy directly led to that paradox you mentioned. The communal aid, the support from the group, was conditional on individual behavior. Societies had and enforced pretty strict moral codes.
What kind of codes?
Well, to even be eligible for membership in the first place, you typically had to be judged of good moral character by the existing members. And you usually had to be engaged in what they considered an honorable occupation. They didn't want members engaged in illegal or morally dubious trades.
Okay, but isn't there a tension here? A potential contradiction? You've been arguing this system was based on self-respect, on earned right, specifically designed to avoid the condescension of charity. But if a committee of your peers can judge you unworthy of benefits because they think you drank too much or maybe just don't like you, doesn't that peer review system risk simply replacing bureaucratic condescension with, local gossip or peer shaming? How do they handle that?
That's a really sharp point. It is the core tension, absolutely. But the fraternalists, the people running and participating in these orders, they argued that the mechanism made all the difference. It's true that aid was routinely, and quite explicitly, denied if a member's disability was found to have resulted from, quote, intemperance or immoral conduct. That was a standard policy in huge orders like the IOOF, the SBA, even women's groups like the Household of Ruth.
So if you got injured in a bar fight you started, you might be out of luck.
You very well might be. However, and this is the crucial part they emphasized, this regulation, this judgment, wasn't made by some distant bureaucrat or a wealthy philanthropist imposing their values. It was administered by a committee of your actual neighbors, people from your lodge, people who likely shared your struggles, your economic class, people who knew you.
So the moral judgment, while it was still there, it came from equals, from peers, not from someone perceived as an outsider or a superior.
That was the argument. They established these investigating committees composed entirely of fellow lodge members whose job it was to vet new applicants for their worthiness, but also to investigate existing claims. Were they legitimate? Was the member genuinely sick or injured, or were they, malingering, trying to defraud the common fund?
Releasing their own.
Exactly. They saw this internal, peer-led regulation as a necessary check. It was vital to ensure the funds remained solvent and were reserved for those who were truly unfortunate through no immediate fault of their own. They viewed it as fundamentally different and much more acceptable than being investigated or judged by impersonal, often distrusted, outsiders from government agencies or charity organizations. And interestingly, even organizations that had more radical, sometimes socialist-leaning roots, like the Workmen's Circle, which was primarily Jewish immigrants, they also diligently upheld quite strict conditional standards for receiving benefits. It shows that this idea of accountability, of conditionality, was pretty central across the board, regardless of the group's specific political ideology.
This emphasis on self-reliance, on managing your own affairs, it also seems to have paved the way for these large, complex, all-female lodges to emerge and thrive. How did these women's organizations, like the Ladies of the Maccabees you mentioned, how did they interpret and apply this concept of self-reliance specifically for women?
That's a fascinating aspect. These all-female organizations, and some were massive, like the Ladies of the Maccabees, LOM, they explicitly saw their participation in running these lodges as vital training in citizenship, in self-government, in financial independence.
How so?
Well, their leaders argued quite forcefully that managing these complex organizations, handling the finances, running meetings according to parliamentary law, making decisions about investments and benefits, all without men involved, it compelled women to develop skills and confidence they might not otherwise gain.
They were deliberately fostering female competence in areas usually dominated by men, like business and finance and civic procedure.
Precisely. Leaders like Frances Burns, who was a major figure in the LOM, she argued that these organizations promoted self-reliance by forcing women to be, quote, thrown upon their own business resources, to be allowed and even compelled to rely upon their own judgment and business sagacity. They argued that women shouldn't become, quote, timid in the presence of men of superior knowledge.
So learning by doing, essentially.
Exactly. And they also recognized, quite pragmatically, that women often face unique economic risks, especially if widowed. Burns pointed out that men left destitute might be often more helpless than a mother left in the same circumstances, implying women needed these insurance and self-help tools, perhaps even more acutely.
So this provided really practical training in leadership and financial management, things that traditional society rarely offered women at that time. It sounds like a very tangible form of empowerment.
It really was, and they even connected their growing status and capabilities directly to the broader economic philosophy that underpinned mutual aid itself. Some leaders cited thinkers like Herbert Spencer, arguing that the historical shift away from older, status-based societies towards modern industrial societies based on contract, voluntary exchange, individual responsibility, that this shift naturally elevated the status of women. It allowed them to enter into contracts, manage their own risks, run their own enterprises. For these women, the fraternal structure wasn't just insurance, it was a vehicle for achieving greater economic and social equality.
Okay, so we've established this incredible system. It's scale, its philosophy of reciprocity, its comprehensive mechanics, the emphasis on self-control and peer regulation. It seems robust, widespread, financially sound for its time. And yet, by mid-20th century, it had significantly declined, at least as that all-encompassing safety net. So the big question is, why? What happened? What forces, external forces mostly, began to systematically dismantle this voluntary model?
It's a crucial question, and the evidence suggests the first major blow didn't actually come from, say, the Great Depression ruining them financially. It came earlier from organized opposition, specifically from the professional class, most notably the medical societies, who launched what amounted to a full-scale war on lodge practice.
Right, that system where the lodge paid doctors a fixed low annual fee per member for care.
Exactly that system. The American Medical Association, the AMA, along with state and local medical societies, they viewed these contracts with intense hostility.
Why? What was their main objection?
Several things. They saw the low fees as fundamentally unethical, arguing it exploited doctors and forced them into rushed, low-quality care, although the evidence for that is debatable. They certainly felt it undercut the prevailing private fee-for-service rates, which threatened their income, and they deeply resented the loss of professional autonomy and the assertiveness of the patients. The fact that patients paying just $2 a year felt entitled to demand the doctor's time and question their judgment.
So essentially, the professional elite organized to protect their economic interests and their professional status, even if it meant undermining a system that provided affordable, accessible care to millions of working-class people.
That's a blunt way to put it, but yes, that appears to be exactly what happened. Medical societies orchestrated very sophisticated, often quite aggressive, boycotts against any physician who dared to sign a lodge contract.
How did the boycotts work?
They would threaten to ostracize the lodge doctor professionally, deny them membership in the medical society, which was becoming increasingly important for status and referrals. And critically, as medicine became more hospital-centered, they would pressure hospitals to deny admitting privileges to these doctors. That was often the killer blow.
So the fraternal orders found themselves in a regulatory and professional battle they just couldn't realistically win without completely compromising their ability to actually deliver the medical care to their members.
Precisely. It put them in an impossible position. Many large organizations like the Fraternal Order of Eagles, FOE, and the Loyal Order of Moose, we see them documented as reluctantly, often after protracted fights, abandoning their direct lodge practice systems.
What did they replace it with?
They usually shifted to providing simple cash sick benefits instead. So instead of guaranteed medical care, the member would just get a weekly stipend if they were too sick to work. It effectively meant they were conceding the whole field of comprehensive health care provision back to the private fee-for-service market, largely to avoid these crippling boycotts against their contracted doctors. The system didn't collapse financially on its own. It was actively dismantled by external professional pressure.
Okay, so that's the first major challenge. That sets the stage then for the second and ultimately maybe larger confrontation, the political battle against compulsory government-run social welfare programs. The fraternalists, you said, became the absolute vanguard of opposition against what they termed paternalism.
Yes, they opposed government social insurance proposals, things like state-mandated health insurance or unemployment benefits, with intense, almost religious fervor. They truly believed it directly undermined the self-reliant character of the American citizen that their organizations were built to foster.
And this fight got particularly heated early on, right? In the early 1900s, against campaigns for compulsory health insurance.
Very heated, especially against the campaigns pushed by groups like the American Association for Labor Legislation, the AAL. They were a prominent group advocating for reforms based on European models, particularly the German social insurance system.
What exactly were the AAL proposals that the fraternal orders found so threatening?
Typically, the AAL and similar groups propose state-mandated health insurance systems. Usually, these involved contributions from both employers and employees managed by the state, and they would cover things like doctor bills, hospital costs, sick pay during illness, and sometimes funeral costs, mainly targeted at low-wage industrial workers.
Which sounds a lot like the benefits the fraternal orders were already providing.
Exactly, and that's why the fraternal leaders saw it as a direct existential threat. It wasn't just competition. They believed it would completely replace their voluntary reciprocal system, which was built on peer relationships and mutual obligation, with a cold, impersonal, state-administered bureaucracy.
And they tended to view the proponents, the people behind the AL, often described in the source material as social reformers and college professors, as being out of touch. Elites trying to impose foreign systems.
They absolutely did. Fraternal leaders frequently argued that these reformers didn't understand American values, that they sought to impose what they called ragged regimentation and fundamentally undermine American liberty and individual responsibility.
Ragged regimentation. That's a great phrase.
Isn't it? They fiercely argued that compulsory systems would destroy the very soul of mutual aid, replacing what they saw as brotherly love and voluntary cooperation with cold-blooded compulsion by the state. They worried it would turn citizens into dependent wards, looking to the government instead of relying on themselves and their communities. The president of the Women's Benefit Association, a major female order, summed up this sentiment perfectly, saying she hoped that most real American citizens still prefer rugged individualism to ragged regimentation.
And the fraternalists were actually remarkably effective in their lobbying efforts, weren't they? For quite a while.
Oh, incredibly effective. They managed to repeatedly defeat compulsory health insurance bills in state legislatures all across the country throughout the 1910s and into the 1920s. They often allied, interestingly, with commercial insurance companies who also fiercely opposed state intervention in the insurance market.
So an alliance of mutuals and commercials against the state.
Yes. The fraternal orders were arguably the most potent political counterforce. They came armed not just with lobbying power, but with this powerful philosophical argument. We're already providing these benefits, they could say, and we're doing it in a way that fosters self-respect, community, and civic responsibility, unlike your bureaucratic state plan. They argued their system, funded and supervised by peers, ensured the money collected was, quote, properly expended and gone to the widows and orphans, implying a level of accountability and care they believed a distant government system could never match.
However, this powerful resistance, this philosophical commitment to voluntarism, it ultimately ran up against the seismic shock of the Great Depression and the political transformation that followed, culminating in the Social Security Act of 1935.
That was the watershed moment, the point of no return, really. But it's absolutely critical to note, as Beito and others emphasize, the fraternal societies themselves generally did not fail financially during the Depression. Their assessment-based insurance structures, while sometimes strained, held up surprisingly well compared to many commercial ventures.
So they weathered the economic storm, mostly.
For the most part, yes. The real impact of Social Security and the old age pensions and unemployment benefits that came with it was more philosophical and practical. It fundamentally negated the perceived necessity of the comprehensive fraternal system for basic survival.
Okay. So once the government stepped in to provide a mandatory baseline safety net, however minimal it might have seemed initially, the primary economic incentive for millions of people to join and diligently pay dues for those specific benefits started to fade.
Exactly. The urgency was reduced, and we see evidence of this almost immediately after 1935. For example, the population at Moose Haven, that large retirement community run by the Loyal Order of Moose, began to decline noticeably. Why? Because residents suddenly became eligible for state-funded old age assistance. They had an alternative.
They didn't need the Moose home in the same way.
Right. And a fraternal leader explicitly noted this trend later, explaining that their order phased out its cash sick benefits not because they were broke, but because, and I'm quoting loosely here, the expansion of Social Security and unemployment compensation by both the national and state government made the payment of the contractual benefits by member lodges less appealing to the average man than it was when the program was instituted.
It confirms that earlier idea, doesn't it? That the comprehensive mutual aid model was in many ways a creature of necessity. And when the government deliberately removed or lessened that foundational necessity, the primary reason for the existence of that whole complex, self-organized system began its long, irreversible decline. Wow. So this whole deep dive, it really forces us to fundamentally rethink how American society was actually structured, how it worked for a very long time. These fraternal societies, they weren't just clubs. They were the living embodiment of that voluntary self-governance model that Tocqueville saw and praised. They created this massive and in many ways arguably superior social welfare system rooted entirely in self-respect, in earned right, and in community action.
The sheer scale of what they achieved is just astonishing when you piece it together. We're talking robust financial security for millions, sophisticated vocational training at places like Mooseheart, and genuinely comprehensive healthcare infrastructure built from the ground up by members, symbolized so powerfully by hospitals like Taborian in Mississippi. This whole history proves that American liberty wasn't just an abstract idea back then. It was a constant active practice of people associating, organizing, and solving their own problems together.
And the legacy, though it's obviously diminished today. Many of these orders still exist, of course, but often more as social or purely charitable clubs. The key takeaway seems to be that the original comprehensive model was largely abandoned, not because it failed financially, not because it was insolvent.
No, the funds held up remarkably well, even in the Depression.
Right, but because external pressures, like from the medical profession, and then the fundamental shift brought by the centralized welfare state, effectively removed the need for citizens to rely on each other quite so intensely, quite so comprehensively.
And that brings us right back to that core philosophical tension this whole history uncovers. If that tradition, that Tocquevillian habit of voluntary, community-led problem-solving, that little platoons mentality that Burke talked about, the thing that builds civic character, trust, and responsibility, if that's so central to fostering self-reliance in a healthy republic, what happens? What happens to the character, the capability, the very fiber of a free society when the necessity for that kind of local mutual aid is largely eliminated by centralized programs?
It really leaves you with a provocative question, doesn't it? Did the New Deal and the subsequent expansion of the welfare state, in its understandable and often noble effort to eliminate absolute destitution, did it inadvertently, over the long run, weaken the very muscles of self-reliance and community action? When the state takes on the primary or even total responsibility for managing life's risks, do citizens perhaps lose the habit of taking responsibility for themselves and their neighbors? Do they lose the skill of association, of organizing together? And maybe do they lose some of that deeply empowering dignity that comes from knowing your security is earned, at least in part, through your own foresight and your commitment to your peers? That's definitely something for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.